I think we have a picture of him. We can post that at this time, image from a Persian miniature. We already have heard a bit of his poetry this morning in our opening hymn, Come, Come, Whoever You Are. But I want to spend a little time before we do the actual reading to say a little bit more about Rumi. You may have heard him referred to as a Sufi. Now, a Sufi is simply a Muslim mystic, and Sufism is the term used to describe the mystical dimension of Islam. Rumi was by no means the first Sufi, but he is certainly the most famous. There are many different schools and versions of Sufism. The order that was created by Rumi's followers after his death is called the Mevlevi order, the so-called whirling dervishes. And I think we have an image here as well. The Mevlevis are best known for their distinctive circling dance of prayer with uplifted hands called the Sema. The right hand is held up, palm up to receive the blessings and energies of the heavens, and the left hand is palm down to transmit that to the earth. That's part of the symbolism. There's much more could get into, but Rumi himself is a beloved figure not only among Muslims, but also among many Jews, Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, and secular persons. For a time in the late 1990s, he was the best-selling poet in America, thanks to the translations of Coleman Barks. Although there are really more versions than translations or renditions, I would say. In 1976, the poet Robert Bly handed Barks a copy of a translation of Rumi's poems by the British Victorian academic A.J. Arbery and said, "These poems need to be released from their cages," of that Victorian academic language. So Barks, who's a fine poet in his own right, but who does not read Persian, spent 20 years working with various translations and developing what he calls his versions of Rumi's poems. Wonderful, wonderful poetry. Now, Rumi was born in the city of Balkh in what is now Afghanistan in the year 1207. His family was forced to flee the invading armies of Genghis Khan, and they ended up in Turkey, which was known by the name of Rum because it had been part of the Roman and Byzantine Empire. Rum is just the version of Rome. So those who, even though the Romans were long gone by then, but that's where his name comes from. He's you might say, the Roman nickname. So they settled in the city of Konya, which is right smack dab in the center of Turkey, a large city today, very large. And Rumi's father was a famous scholar of Islamic law and jurisprudence. And upon his father's death, his son succeeded him and was a very, very successful and respected scholar. And one day, a wandering dervish came from the east, a stranger named Shams al-Tabriz, whose name means literally the sun up in the sky. There are many legendary stories about their first meeting. The one that I like best tells of Shams approaching the outdoor classroom where Rumi was sitting beside a beautiful fountain in the courtyard, holding forth before a captivated audience. And Shamsuddin looked at the stack of holy manuscripts beside the teacher and said, "What's this?" And Rumi, who was quite full of himself, answered sarcastically, "Something you wouldn't understand." And at that, according to the story, Shams picked up the pile of sacred texts and threw them into the fountain, saying, "Now you must live what you have only known from books." And when the manuscripts were retrieved, according to the legend, the ink was somehow restored to the pages. And an astonished Rumi said, "What's this?" And Shams replied, "Something you wouldn't understand." So that's one of the legends. But following that encounter, there's no other way to put it than to say that Rumi fell utterly in love with Shamsuddin. And they spent time together apart from the other students until Shams disappeared, or some people think he was disappeared by jealous students of Rumi. But at any rate, Rumi was grief-stricken by the absence of his beloved friend and spent the rest of his life really writing poetry that spoke of the deep longing and yearning for union with the divine, represented by the beloved. In 1925, when Turkey became an aggressively secular state under Kemal Ataturk, all Sufi orders were banned and had to go underground to survive. Even in Konya, the dance, I forgot if it was called the Sema, this ceremony, was banned until well into the 1950s. In 1953, it was allowed to take place again as a strictly secular performance with a non-participating audience looking on as spectators. When I visited Konya about 20 years ago, it was made very clear to me that the dancers were in no way performing a religious ceremony. You know, these were anthropology students just demonstrating something of historical interest. Don't dare think that they are doing something religious. But you know what? You can't fake the ecstasy in the faces of these dancers as they prayed in this manner. And I couldn't fake the feeling of resonance within myself. Call it what you will. It's a religious ceremony. So here's the lovely synchronicity and why I'm spending all this time. That each year on December 17th, this day, pilgrims flock to Konya from all over the world to celebrate what is called Shebi Aras, literally the night of the bride or the wedding night, in honor of Rumi. It's not the anniversary of Rumi's birth, but rather of his death, which is understood as a reunion with the beloved, from whom we experience ourselves as somehow separated during our lifetime. I think there are some more images. Maybe you can show these just in quick succession. This is in Konya. This is the mosque there. In the background, the green lit tower you see, that's actually the tomb of Rumi. And you can go on to, I think there's a close-up of that. Yeah, very. And then the next one shows inside. This is his actual tomb, this beautiful carpeting and the kind of turban or a fez-like headpiece you see, very, very large, but that sits on top of the tomb as well. It's a very, and again, in the secular understanding of the government has changed quite drastically now, but this was referred to as a museum, not a tomb. This is a museum. And people were very quiet and reverent. It was very busy then, and that was in the middle of the summer. So in his poetry, Rumi uses the metaphor of the hollow reed that has been harvested from the riverbed, cut with a sharp sickle and formed into a flute through which the divine spirit continues to breathe. His poetic masterpiece, called the Mathnawi, consists of over 27,000 verses, and the opening poem of that work is called The Song of the Reed Flute. So we're already well into this sermon on transcending mystery and wonder. That phrase, of course, comes from our Unitarian Universalist tradition. If you turn in your hymnals to the unnumbered page right after the preface, in the front of the book, there's a title page. This is after the preface. You'll see a page that looks like this, and a statement that begins, "We, the member congregations." Have you got that? We Unitarian Universalists don't have a creed, but we do have a covenant, a framework of values and commitments and promises. This covenant is embedded in the otherwise dry administrative language of the bylaws of the Unitarian Universalist Association, where it takes the form of 7 principles and 6 sources. We tend to focus on the principles, the values that we promise to affirm and promote. They're up on the board over here, and that's fine, but they remain mere abstractions unless they are grounded in stories, rituals, traditions, and particular people, places, and practices. And that's what the sources are for. I think of it as a bird with 2 wings. You can't fly with just the principles. You need to be connected to these sources in various ways. So I want to call your attention to the very first source, direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces that create and uphold life. Now, it's no accident that this stands first among the sources. This is where our belief systems begin. This is where any subsequent theological reflection must start from. This is the primary layer, the ground floor of the spiritual life. This is where we find the raw material for our spirituality. It all begins with experience, and with a certain kind of experience at that, namely the experience of transcending mystery and wonder. What I will be calling in this sermon mystical experience or mysticism. Here's the simple definition of mysticism. It's simply the direct experience of the divine, not mediated through texts or traditions or even a beloved teacher, but firsthand experience, a direct encounter with mystery. The French philosopher Henri Bergson said, "Religion is the crystallization brought about by the cooling of what mysticism had poured white hot into the soul of a human being. Through religion, all people get a little of what a few privileged persons get in full. Religion," he concluded, "is mysticism for the masses." So it's sort of a watered down version, you might say. Around the same time that Bergson was writing, the American philosopher and psychologist William James was revolutionizing the study of religion in his 1901-1902 Gifford Lectures, later published as The Varieties of Religious Experience. He was focusing as a psychologist, as well as a philosopher, on the individual psychological experience. I think we have a picture of William James. You can put that up if you have it. And in college, I had a double major in psychology and religion, and I did my senior thesis on William James, and in particular on his treatment of mysticism. And as he described it, and he used lots and lots of examples from firsthand testimony of various people, he said he himself was temperamentally incapable of mystical experience. But he was enough of an empirical scientist to say, there's all this testimony to it, so I'm going to study it. And that's what he set about to do. So he identified 4 characteristics of psychological, from a psychological perspective, that he said characterized mystical experience. They're easy to remember using the simple mnemonic device PINT, pint, which stands for passive, ineffable, noetic, Noetic, which means having to do with knowledge, and transient, they're passing. So I'll just walk through those in order with you. Mystical experience is passive, according to James. It can't be actively manufactured or predicted or engineered or guaranteed or earned. Mystical experiences are simply given and must be properly, that is to say, passively received. Typically, according to James, these moments arise spontaneously. They're experiences of being, not doing. But we can prepare ourselves for them in a certain way. The Zen Buddhists have a saying, enlightenment is an accident, but meditation makes you accident prone. Christians might put it, salvation is an accident, or grace is an accident, but prayer could make you accident prone, a practice. But at the end of the day, it's not something you can make happen. These experiences may seem to come out of nowhere. One of my favorite examples is recorded by Thomas Merton, who was a Trappist monk at Gethsemane Abbey in Kentucky. He was a hermit among hermits. He had his own place away from the rest of the hermits who had vows of silence, where he wrote volumes and volumes of poetry and essays. But occasionally he had to go into Louisville. He had a bad back problem, and he would go in to have that attended to. And in his book, Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, he describes what happened on one of those visits. In Louisville, he writes, at the corner of 4th and Walnut, in the center of the shopping district, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all these people, that they were mine and I was theirs, that we could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. It was like waking from a dream of separateness, of specious self-isolation in a special world. He was a monk, after all, the world of renunciation and supposed holiness. This sense of liberation from an illusory difference was such a relief and such a joy to me that I almost laughed out loud. I have the immense joy of being human, a member of a race in which God himself became incarnate. As if the sorrows and stupidities of the human condition could overwhelm me, now I realize what we all are. And if only everybody could realize this, but it cannot be explained. There is no way of telling people that they are all walking around shining like the sun. So that was a mystical moment. In Louisville, when the General Assembly was in Louisville some years ago, I remember I made a little mini pilgrimage to that intersection of 4th and Walnut, and there's a big plaque there commemorating that moment. Now, in this statement, Merton is verging the second characteristic of James's analysis, which is ineffability. Language is incapable of fully conveying what occurs in a mystical experience. It simply cannot be articulated. Now, there's a paradox here because mystics, including Rumi and Thomas Merton at the head of the list, churn out, when they try, they keep trying to articulate what has happened, but always saying, no, I can't, words cannot explain or describe what is happening here. It's a paradox. But this ineffability is a feature, not a bug. It's not as if we just got a lot smarter or better poets could do it, could succeed. It's built in the Taoist tradition, Chinese tradition, the ancient scripture, the Tao Te Ching, wonderful, wonderful book. The first chapter, the opening line of the Tao Te Ching. The Tao, by the way, in Chinese means the way. It's just the way it is, the way things are, the way, as well as the way to go, the path, if you will. So it begins, the Tao that can be spoken of is not the eternal Tao. Those who say do not know, and those who know do not say. It's a good example of that kind of ineffability. I remember in college when we were studying Taoism, a classmate of mine, we had a blue book exam, and it was something like, explain the history and development of Taoist religion, blah, blah, blah. And this classmate of mine was sitting close by, opened his blue book, he wrote something, which I later learned was, he wrote in his exam book, those who say do not know, and those who know do not say. Well, he got an F on that exam, but he passed the course. I thought that was pretty bold of him. So those who know may not say, but they do know something. And this is what James called the noetic dimension, the noetic quality, that something is understood or apprehended, even if it's not comprehended. We learn something from this experience. The Ogallala spiritual teacher Black Elk experienced this in his famous vision on Harney Peak in the Black Hills. While I stood there, he said, I saw more than I can tell. I saw more than I can tell, and I understood more than I saw. For I was seeing in a sacred manner the shape of all things in the spirit, and the shape of all shapes, as they must live together like one being. And I saw that it was holy. So this sense of understanding, if it's understanding our place in the scheme of things. And the final characteristic, according to James, is transience. It's fleeting. The attempt to grasp it, to secure it, to seize it, hold it, guarantees its disappearance. William Blake wrote, he who binds himself to a joy doth the winged life destroy, but he who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise. So there's that notion that it's going to pass. All things pass, but this moment will pass, and yet it has a lasting impact. I've always loved the definition of revelation. This is another one of those words we can talk about tomorrow night. It was given by the great 20th century Christian theologian H. Richard Niebuhr. Revelation, he said, means that part of our inner history which illuminates the rest of it and which is itself intelligible. Sometimes when we read a difficult book seeking to follow a complicated argument, we come across a luminous sentence from which we can go forward and backward and so attain some understanding of the whole. So we can return again and again to our revelatory mystical experiences, our moments of transcending mystery and wonder in that same way for the light that they shed on the whole of our life. So back to my senior thesis on William James. The exam was going very well at the table with 3 professors and myself. And my favorite professor, Professor Gohegan, leaned over the table, looked over the top of my glasses, and said, Mr. Johnson. He always called me Mr. Johnson. Have you ever had a mystical experience? It was like Shamsuddin throwing the senior thesis in the fountain in that moment. I honestly don't remember what I said. But it was about that. This is all academic and theoretical. What is your personal acquaintance with this, to use James's term, your knowledge by acquaintance with mystical experience? Nowadays, today I would answer yes. Yes, I have. I'd probably begin with the story of the only time really I saw the Grand Canyon. It was following the General Assembly in Phoenix in 1997. I took my then 13-year-old son, Matthew, up to the south rim of the Grand Canyon. There's a fringe of trees. We park and you walk through the trees, and there it is. And I was totally caught by my reaction. What happened was that I began to laugh. And it wasn't ordinary laughter. It wasn't a ha-ha kind of laughter. It was this, in fact, I wasn't laughing so much as I was being laughed. That's the only way I can struggle to describe it. I was being laughed. That's that passive quality. The laughter was coming up through the ground, through the bottom of my feet, and just rolling in waves through my body. And it lasted maybe a minute or two. It subsided. That's the transience. And, it was an awesome experience. We tend to reserve the language of awe for experiences that are grand and dramatic and overwhelming, vast, enormous scales that expand or even explode our sense of time and space. But it doesn't have to be that way. Mystical experiences can also be tender, subtle, intimate, and gentle. A few years ago, I visited that same son, then 35 and a new father. And there I was able for the first time to hold my grandchild and to see him smile, or to feel him smile with his whole body. And that too was direct experience of transcending mystery and wonder. I want to, so the great lesson really from the mystics is that the sacred is in the ordinary. It's to be found in one's daily life, in one's neighbors, friends, and family, in your own backyard. This feeling of oneness, of union, of unity, overcoming the sense of separateness. And this is part of our Unitarian Universalist tradition. I want to show one last slide, if you have it, of Ralph Waldo Emerson. There he is, yeah. So what is it, we talk about transcending mystery and wonder. What is it that we are transcending in this experience? And I would say, following Emerson, that what we are transcending is our narrow sense of egotistical, ego-centered selfhood. That is what is being transcended, that small sense. I'm just going to read a quote from his famous essay, Nature. This is his mystical experience. Crossing a bare common, he says, in snow puddles at twilight under a clouded sky, without having in my thoughts any occurrence of special good fortune, I have enjoyed a perfect exhilaration. I am glad to the brink of fear. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God. Now, this image of the transparent eyeball, the well-known cartoonist Christopher Cranch, who was also Unitarian, couldn't help himself lampooning this in the Boston Press. You see the transparent eyeball on the top, the spindly-legged body. But, Emerson had the last laugh. He, not single-handedly, but he spearheaded the development of what is called the Transcendentalist movement, which validates the reality and the centrality of mystical experience in religious life, including Unitarian Universalists.